Hello there, and welcome to the Sleepless Scientist, a quiet place in the cosmos where your thoughts can unwind, and knowledge becomes a soft lullaby for the night. Tonight's journey will take us into one of the most intimate and mysterious landscapes we can explore. Consciousness, the silent narrator that follows you through every moment of your life. But before you settle in and get cozy, I'd love if you could take a moment to like this video and subscribe. Only if you truly find these quiet explorations enjoyable. And when you're ready, leave a comment to let me know where in the world you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. It's always such a joy to see all the places we gather from, each in our own little slice of time. Now feel free to dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for a soft background hum, and let's gently begin our journey into consciousness together. And if your mind begins to wander, that's perfectly fine. Let it drift. We'll still be here, quietly unfolding the story. Consciousness is one of those words that's hard to pin down. It can feel abstract, slippery, something we know from the inside but struggle to explain from the outside. In some ways, it's like trying to taste your own tongue. We use it constantly, rely on it for every thought and memory, and yet it's almost invisible to us. And yet, it is always here, like a quiet background hum. If you close your eyes right now, there is still the awareness of sound, the faint memory of what you just saw, the steady presence of your own body. That presence, that awareness, is what we're talking about tonight. Some people think of consciousness as the mind stage, where thoughts and sensations appear like actors under a spotlight. Others think of it as a flowing river, always moving, never the same twice, carrying with it everything you've seen and felt. And some, more poetically, describe it as the gentle voice reading the story of your life in the background, even when you're too distracted to listen. Whatever metaphor you choose, it's something you live inside every day, often without noticing. The fascinating and slightly unsettling thing is that consciousness is deeply personal. No one else can ever truly step inside yours, and you can never fully step inside theirs. You could describe the colour blue, compare it to the sky or the ocean, but no matter how carefully you choose your words, the exact shade you see is yours alone. This what it's like quality, the raw feel of an experience, is something philosophers call qualia. It's the reason a song might make you cry, or a scent suddenly take you back to childhood, even though someone else listening or smelling the same thing might feel nothing at all. Scientists have spent centuries trying to understand how this inner world comes to be. They can map brain activity, trace nerve signals, measure hormones and neurotransmitters, and yet, the leap from those physical processes to the feeling of being you remains one of the greatest mysteries in science. The philosopher David Chalmers famously called it the hard problem of consciousness. How does the firing of neurons in a lump of biological tissue produce the feeling of falling in love, or the bittersweet ache of nostalgia, or the comfort of knowing you are home? It might seem like a puzzle reserved for lecture halls and laboratories, but really, it's something you brush up against every day. Every time you notice that you're thinking, or when you catch yourself drifting in a daydream, or when you're pulled suddenly back into the present by the sound of your name, you're meeting consciousness face to face. If that sounds abstract, don't worry. Tonight, we're not going to dissect it with harsh, clinical precision. We're going to walk through it slowly, like exploring a familiar street at night, noticing details we usually overlook in the daytime rush. We'll wander through the way ancient civilizations imagined the soul, how modern neuroscience looks for its footprints in the brain, the strange ways consciousness can flicker, shift, or split, and what we've learned from animals, machines, and those final moments at the edge of life. But we'll begin here, in this moment, with the simplest truth. Whatever else it may be, consciousness is happening right now as you hear these words. It is the soft awareness of your breath moving in and out, the sensation of fabric against your skin, the awareness that you are aware. Even if the rest of the world fades, Even if thoughts scatter like leaves in the wind, that quiet knowing remains. So as we set off on this journey together, try not to chase definitions or demand answers too quickly. Let the ideas drift in and out, the way clouds drift across the sky. We'll pause often, not because we are lost, but because some questions deserve to be lingered over. After all, if consciousness is the very thing that lets you experience the world, then slowing down to notice it might be the closest we ever get to understanding it. Now, take one more slow breath. Let it fill your lungs, and then leave gently, like a wave sliding back into the sea. Feel the weight of your body where it rests, the soft pull of the earth beneath you. Whatever the mystery of consciousness may be, it has carried you here to this moment, and for now, that is enough. If you've ever tried to explain to someone exactly what you mean by consciousness, you may have felt that peculiar frustration of watching your words slip away the moment they leave your mouth. You reach for metaphors, you borrow ideas from philosophy or science, you point to examples in daily life, but still, it feels as though you're trying to describe the taste of water. It's everywhere, it's familiar, it's essential, but the moment you try to pin it down, it slides through your fingers. Scientists and philosophers have both wrestled with this for centuries, often in their own languages, sometimes overlapping, sometimes drifting apart. To a philosopher, consciousness might be framed as subjective experience, the private first-person quality of being you, at this moment, in this body, with these thoughts and sensations. To a neuroscientist, it might be described as the accessibility of information for reasoning, decision-making, and control of behavior, a more functional definition, stripped of poetry, but grounded in measurable activity. These two perspectives don't always agree on where the boundaries are, but both acknowledge something remarkable. There is a difference between the machinery of perception and the feeling of perceiving. This difference is sometimes illustrated by separating the so-called easy problems from the hard problem of consciousness. The easy problems, though easy here is a generous understatement, are the kinds of questions we can imagine answering with enough scientific data. How does the brain process visual input? How do we recognize faces? What neural circuits are active when we recall a memory or solve a puzzle? These are difficult in practice, but conceptually approachable. The hard problem, as philosopher David Chalmers named it in the 1990s, is something else entirely. How does a physical brain, with its cells and chemicals and electrical impulses, give rise to the raw, intimate feeling of being alive? How do neurons firing in patterns become the sound of rain at night, the taste of bread fresh from the oven, or the ache of missing someone? To make sense of this, some turn to the idea of qualia, those tiny building blocks of subjective life, the what it's like of each sensation. Qualia are what make red feel red to you, and not green or blue, and what give a melody its particular sadness or joy. They can't be measured directly. You can't hand a qualia to someone else the way you'd hand them a seashell or a spoon. You can only describe it and hope their own experience resonates enough to bridge the gap. Think about the last time you smelled something that brought back a memory. Maybe the scent of a flower from a childhood garden, or the aroma of a food you haven't tasted in years. In an instant, without effort, your mind is somewhere else entirely, not just picturing the place, but being there in a way that is more than mental. That deep, layered sensation is consciousness working in a way no diagram of the brain can truly capture. The neurons can be mapped, the chemical reactions named, but the richness of that moment is more than the sum of its physical parts. And yet, despite the mystery, there is value in trying to outline what we mean when we say consciousness. It can be thought of as the capacity to have experiences, to be aware of something, whether that something is the warmth of a blanket against your skin, the thought of tomorrow's plans, or the quiet noticing of your own breath. It is not limited to being awake, because we are conscious in varying ways, even in dreams. It is not limited to deep thinking. because we are conscious when we simply sit and watch the world without naming or judging it. Some definitions lean toward the poetic, consciousness as the light that illuminates the theatre of the mind. Others lean toward the mechanical, consciousness as information being integrated and made available across different parts of the brain. And then there are those who argue that perhaps it cannot be defined completely at all, that it is one of those fundamental aspects of reality that can only be known from within, never fully translated into objective terms. In daily life, we rarely stop to define it, because we are so deeply embedded within it. You don't usually wake up and think, here I am, conscious again. You simply open your eyes, feel the weight of your body against the bed, notice the light in the room, perhaps hear the distant sound of water running, and your awareness flows outward from there. It's only when something changes, when consciousness dims in sleep, shifts in a dream, sharpens in a moment of danger, or is altered by illness, that we notice how strange and precious it really is. So why begin here, with definitions and distinctions? Because even though they will not solve the mystery, they will give us a map for the journey ahead. When we talk about consciousness later, in animals, in machines, in the moments before death, we'll be able to return to these core ideas and see how they shift and stretch. Like the edges of a puzzle, they will frame our exploration, even if the picture inside is still incomplete. For now, perhaps it is enough to hold a working sense of the word in your mind. Consciousness is the private, continuous, and ever-changing awareness that makes your life yours. It's the unseen backdrop for every thought and feeling, the quiet stage on which each moment appears. And as we move forward, we will see just how many ways that stage can be lit, how many performances it can hold, and how even the simplest moments can feel vast when we take the time to notice them. If consciousness is the broad landscape we live within, then the self, the one who speaks in your thoughts, who remembers your past and imagines your future, is like a small, persistent traveller moving across it. Some call this presence the inner narrator, a voice that may be silent or loud, clear or blurry, but that quietly frames your experience into a kind of unfolding story. You can hear it right now if you listen. The moment I mention it, your attention may turn inward, and there it is, not the sound of my voice, but the one that repeats a phrase in your head, that comments on what you're hearing, that asks itself whether it's time to shift position or pull the blanket a little closer. This narrator is not necessarily the whole of consciousness. There are thoughts and feelings outside its reach, but it is the part we most often identify as me. William James, often called the father of modern psychology, wrote about consciousness as a stream, a flow of thoughts, sensations and impressions that never stops moving. The inner narrator swims within that stream, plucking out certain moments to string together into the story you tell yourself about your life. Sometimes it feels as though the narrator is in control, guiding you from one idea to the next. At other times, it is more like a bystander, watching the flow go by and offering occasional remarks, almost as though it were surprised by your own thoughts. What's remarkable is that this narrator doesn't just describe what's happening, it shapes it. Imagine walking through a familiar street on a grey afternoon. You could notice the drizzle on your skin, think of it as dreary, and feel a heaviness settle in your chest. Or you could notice the way the rain makes the air smell clean, watch it bead and roll off the leaves, and feel a quiet comfort in the routine of it. The events are the same. What changes is the narrative your mind wraps around them. That story colours the entire moment. Sometimes the narrator works so quickly that you don't even realise it's there. You reach for a cup, take a sip, set it down, all without a conscious script. But if something unexpected happens, the cup is warmer than you thought, or the liquid tastes unusual, the narrator steps in to explain, to frame, to make sense. It is as though the mind maintains a background hum of interpretation, only turning up the volume when the familiar pattern is interrupted. There are moments when the narrator quiets, and the lived moment takes over entirely. These are the times when you are so absorbed in what you're doing that self-consciousness falls away. Reading a book that holds you so completely you forget where you are, watching the light shift across the floor until everything else fades, or being caught in a conversation that seems to flow without effort. Psychologists sometimes call this flow, but it can also happen in the simplest daily tasks, like washing dishes while listening to the gentle clink of plates and the sound of water running. In these moments, you're still conscious, but not busy narrating your own experience. The story pauses, and you are simply there. And yet, the narrator always returns. Even when you drift into daydream, it's often the narrator who casts the scene, setting you in a place, inventing a conversation, rehearsing something that might never happen. Sometimes it's comforting, sometimes critical, sometimes endlessly repetitive. Some spiritual traditions encourage noticing this constant chatter, not to silence it entirely, but to see it for what it is, a layer between you and the rawness of the present moment. Modern neuroscience has begun to connect this sense of a narrator to specific patterns of brain activity, especially in what's called the default mode network, a set of regions that tend to be active when your mind is not focused on an external task. It is this network that lights up when you're recalling the past, imagining the future, or thinking about yourself and others. In a way, it may be the biological seat of the storyteller, but even if we can trace its pathways, that doesn't capture the full richness of how it feels to inhabit that role. Because the inner narrator is more than brain activity. It is a companion that shapes the emotional texture of our lives. Think about the difference between a memory told in words and the same memory told in pictures, scents, and sensations. The narrator tends toward words, but consciousness itself is a wider canvas, and sometimes the two are out of sync. You can tell yourself you're calm, while your body hums with nervous energy. You can insist you're fine, while your mind keeps circling back to a single worry. Understanding this narrator, noticing when it is speaking, when it is silent, and how it colours your world, is a quiet kind of skill. It doesn't mean you have to change the story it tells, but it can mean recognising that it is a story, one version among many possible versions of the moment you're in. And once you see that, you might find a little more space inside your awareness, space to let the rain smell like rain without deciding whether it's a good day or a bad one, space to let a memory drift by without needing to wrap it in words, space to simply live the moment before the narrator has finished writing it. So as we continue our journey, keep an ear out for that inner voice, not to judge it or quiet it, but to notice it, the way you might notice a friend walking beside you, talking softly as you explore a new place together. Sometimes you'll listen closely. Sometimes you'll let the sound of their voice fade into the background while you take in the scenery. Either way, the narrator will still be there, moving with you, shaping and sharing in the experience of being alive. Long before anyone could look at a brain scan or trace the path of an electrical signal through neurons, people still wondered about the same quiet presence we've been talking about. The you behind your eyes, the one who thinks and feels. In a world without microscopes or medical imaging, these questions were answered in stories, in rituals, and in the symbols carved into stone. If you wandered through the streets of ancient Mesopotamia, the question of consciousness would not have been one of biology, but of divine breath. To live was to be animated by the gods, each person's mind and soul a kind of spark borrowed from something greater. Dreams were thought to be messages from beyond, slipping into the mind while the body rested. Priests and dream interpreters made sense of these nightly visions, believing they were windows into truths that waking eyes could not see. In Egypt, you might have been told that your mind did not live in your head at all. The heart, warm and central in the chest, was seen as the seat of thought, feeling, and memory. The brain, by contrast, was so unimportant that in mummification it was often discarded, while the heart was carefully preserved. In the afterlife, the heart would be weighed against the feather of truth, a test not only of morality but, in a way, of the essence of the person. To them, the rhythm of your heartbeat was more than a biological function. It was the drumbeat of the self. Travel east to India, and the conversation shifts again. The ancient Hindu concept of Atman describes a true self, eternal and unchanging, distinct from the body and mind yet experienced through them. In Buddhist traditions, the idea turns inside out. Instead of an eternal soul, there is a nature, or no self, the understanding that what we call a self is a constantly changing collection of sensations, thoughts, and experiences without a single, permanent core. Consciousness, in this view, is a process rather than a possession, something that arises and fades moment by moment, like waves on the surface of the sea. Ancient Chinese philosophy often framed the mind in terms of harmony between body and spirit, between the individual and the natural world. The heart-mind, Xin, was not separated into cold reason and warm feeling. Thinking and emotion were part of the same current. In Taoist thought, the ideal was to let consciousness flow freely, unblocked by rigid control, so that it could move in tune with the greater rhythms of life. In Greece, philosophers began to carve the mind into conceptual parts, trying to understand its structure. Plato imagined the soul as having three components: reason, spirit, and appetite. A charioteer guiding two horses, each pulling in different directions. Aristotle, more grounded in observation, saw the soul as the form of the body, inseparable from it, yet still responsible for life and awareness. Here, consciousness began to be discussed not just as a mystical essence, but as something tied to perception, memory, and thought in a way that could be studied. Even in early medicine, attempts were made to locate and understand consciousness. The physician Hippocrates, observing the effects of head injuries, suggested that the brain was the seat of sensation and thought, an idea that would not become widely accepted for centuries. Galen, in the Roman era, expanded on this with studies of the nervous system, though even he spoke of the soul in ways that blended anatomy with philosophy. In all of these traditions, the line between spiritual and physical explanations was thin. Consciousness was not something people thought of as separate from the rest of life. It was woven into beliefs about the body, the soul, the afterlife, and the natural order. Whether it was imagined as a divine gift, a permanent self, an illusion of selfhood, or a harmony to be maintained, it was always considered central to being human. Looking back, it's easy to smile at how wrong some of these ideas were by today's standards. The heart as the thinking organ, the breath as the literal essence of life. But there is also something deeply human in them, something that connects us to those ancient thinkers. They too were trying to explain the quiet miracle of being aware, using the tools they had, the beat of the heart, the shape of dreams, the patterns of thought they could feel but not see. And perhaps it's worth remembering that while our explanations have grown more detailed, the core mystery remains. We may have traded temple rituals for brain scans, but the feeling of looking inward and wondering, what is this exactly, has not changed. The ancients stood at the edge of that question just as we do, watching their thoughts ripple through their minds like reflections on water, knowing that whatever this presence is, it's what makes life feel like life. By the time Europe entered the early modern period, the old maps of the mind, drawn from spiritual traditions and ancient philosophy, were beginning to fray at the edges. The Renaissance had rekindled curiosity, not only about art and the natural world, but about the workings of human thought itself. Printing presses spread new ideas quickly, and voyages across the globe brought encounters with different cultures and their beliefs. In the midst of all this change, questions about consciousness began to take on a new shape, less about divine breath or eternal soul, and more about how the mind might be understood through reason and observation. One of the most famous voices of this era belonged to the French philosopher René Descartes. In the early 1600s, he set himself the task of finding a foundation for knowledge that could not be doubted. What if, he wondered, everything he saw, heard and felt was an illusion? What if a deceptive power was feeding him false impressions of the world? Stripping away every assumption, he arrived at a single certainty. The fact that he was thinking meant that he existed. Cogito ergo sum. I think, therefore I am. For Descartes, the mind and body were distinct. The mind was the seat of thought and consciousness, something immaterial and indivisible, while the body was a mechanical structure that occupied space. He imagined the two interacting through a small gland deep in the brain, the pineal gland, a choice that made sense to him because it was a single structure rather than paired, unlike most parts of the brain. Today, we know this isn't the mind's control room, but in Descartes' time, the idea that the immaterial could meet the material in such a place was both bold and deeply appealing. While Descartes' dualism shaped much of the philosophical debate that followed, others took different paths. The English philosopher John Locke, writing later in the 17th century, placed less emphasis on a split between mind and body, and more on how consciousness connected to identity. For Locke, personal identity was built from memory, the ability to recall past experiences and recognize them as your own. Without memory, the self would dissolve into disconnected moments. It was a practical view, rooted in the day-to-day continuity that makes you feel like the same person you were yesterday, even though your body has changed in small ways. This focus on experience and perception deepened in the 18th century with the German philosopher Immanuel Kant. Kant believed that while our senses provide raw data about the world, the mind actively organizes this data according to its own built-in structures. Space and time, for example, were not just things out there in the world. They were part of the framework our minds used to interpret what we sensed. In this way, consciousness was not a passive mirror, but a creative participant, shaping reality as we experienced it. It's easy to imagine these men, working in candlelit rooms surrounded by papers and books, turning these ideas over slowly in their minds. They lived in an age when the physical sciences were gathering momentum, yet the tools for studying the brain directly were still crude. Philosophy remained the primary instrument for exploring the mind, and it was wielded with both precision and imagination. At the same time, medicine and anatomy were advancing. The circulation of the blood had been mapped, the heart understood in mechanical terms, and surgeons were beginning to see the nervous system as a network that transmitted signals much like wires. These discoveries fed into a growing sense that perhaps the mind was not entirely separate from the body, that thoughts and sensations might emerge from physical processes after all. This tension between the immaterial soul of Descartes and the material mind of the emerging sciences would become one of the defining debates of the centuries to follow. The rise of materialism brought with it a kind of daring simplicity. Perhaps consciousness was not a mysterious essence at all, but simply the activity of the brain. This was a radical thought at the time, and not everyone welcomed it. For many, reducing consciousness to physical matter felt like stripping away its dignity, its mystery, even its meaning. But for others, it was an opening, a chance to study the mind in the same way one might study the stars or the growth of plants, by observation, hypothesis, and experiment. As early psychology began to take shape in the 18th and 19th centuries, it carried with it this mix of philosophical reflection and scientific curiosity. The study of the mind was still, in many ways, a branch of philosophy, but it was leaning more heavily on the emerging tools of science. Questions that had once been purely speculative, like how memory works or how attention can shift, were starting to be examined through experiments, however simple by modern standards. Looking back, it's striking how these early modern thinkers stood on a bridge between worlds. Behind them lay centuries of spiritual and symbolic explanations for consciousness. Ahead of them stretched a future in which the mind would be studied in laboratories, scanned in living brains and modelled in computers. They could not see all of that future, but they were already feeling the shift beneath their feet. A movement from myth to measurement, from soul to self to synapse. And yet, despite the changes in language and method, the heart of the question was still the same. Whether framed as a divine gift, a property of the soul, or the product of a physical brain, consciousness remained the quiet mystery at the centre of our experience. The thing we notice most when we stop to look inward, and the thing we still cannot fully explain. If the early modern philosophers built the bridge between soul and self, the neuroscientists of the last century have walked further along it, peering into the brain itself in search of the places and patterns where consciousness might be hiding. This search has led to what is often called the study of the neural correlates of consciousness, or NCC, the physical processes in the brain that reliably match up with the presence of awareness. It is worth remembering that not so long ago this would have been impossible. For most of human history, the living brain was untouchable, too fragile, too hidden inside bone. Now, with tools like functional magnetic resonance imaging, fMRI, and electroencephalography, EEG, we can watch, in real time, as patterns of blood flow and electrical activity ripple through it. These images are not consciousness itself, but like shadows on the wall, they tell us something about where the fire might be burning. One of the most important discoveries in this field is that no single spot in the brain holds consciousness entirely. Instead, it seems to depend on a network of regions, working together in ways that are still being mapped. The prefrontal cortex, for instance, is often active when we're aware of our thoughts, weighing decisions, or holding information in mind. It is like the stage manager of a play, keeping track of cues and making sure the right elements come together at the right time. The thalamus, a small structure deep in the brain, acts as a kind of relay station, passing sensory information from the outside world to the cortex. If the cortex is the stage, the thalamus is the set of doors through which all the actors and props arrive. When the thalamus is damaged or disrupted, awareness can fade dramatically, even if the rest of the brain remains intact. There is also the default mode network, a set of areas that tend to hum with activity when we are not focused on the outside world. This network is often linked to daydreaming, recalling the past, imagining the future, and reflecting on the self. It's almost like the quiet inner lounge of the mind, where the narrator from our earlier sessions settles in when there's no pressing task at hand. Interestingly, when we become deeply absorbed in a challenging activity, this network's activity drops, making room for other systems to take over. Below these higher-level regions lies the brainstem, a structure so ancient that we share it with far simpler animals. Within it are the arousal systems, networks that keep us awake and alert, regulating the difference between deep sleep and full wakefulness. If these systems are damaged, consciousness can disappear entirely, even if the cortex remains intact and healthy. In this way, the brainstem is less like a spotlight on the stage and more like the power supply to the entire theatre. The study of NCC has also shown us that brain activity and conscious awareness do not always match perfectly. There are moments when the brain processes information without us being aware of it, as in blind sight, where a person with damage to the visual cortex can respond to visual cues they cannot consciously see. This dissociation reminds us that consciousness is not simply the sum of all brain activity, but a particular way that activity is integrated and made accessible to the you that notices it. Modern imaging studies have deepened this picture. Using fMRI, researchers can watch as certain brain regions light up when a subject becomes aware of a stimulus, compared to when the same stimulus is processed without awareness. EEG provides a more rapid, moment-to-moment look, showing how patterns of electrical activity change in the split second when something crosses the threshold into consciousness. Together, these tools are giving us a map of sorts, not of consciousness itself, but of the terrain where it tends to appear. Still, even with all this technology, the search for NCC is like listening to the muffled sound of music through a wall. We can hear its rhythm, feel its presence, and even guess at its patterns, but the source remains hidden from direct view. We know that certain structures and connections are crucial. We can measure the difference between a brain in deep sleep and one that is wide awake. We can see how anesthesia alters communication between brain regions, dimming awareness until it goes dark. But the leap from these patterns of activity to the lived experience of being is as mysterious as ever. Perhaps that is why the study of NCC feels less like the end of a search and more like a deepening of it. Every answer opens another question. Why these regions and not others? How does activity in one part of the brain become part of the unified whole we call consciousness? Are there forms of awareness that slip under the radar of our current methods, like faint stars invisible to the naked eye? For now, what we can say is that consciousness seems to emerge not from a single spark, but from a web of interactions, a conversation between different parts of the brain, some ancient, some newer, each contributing its own voice to the chorus of awareness. And in the quiet spaces between these voices, the mystery remains, waiting for us to listen more closely. Space theory explains how information becomes widely available, but some argue it doesn't capture the felt quality of experience, the qualia we spoke about earlier. Integrated information theory offers a mathematical approach, but its implications, such as the possibility of consciousness in very simple systems, are controversial. Higher order thought theory elegantly explains self-awareness, but some question whether it leaves room for experiences that feel rich and immediate without being reflected on. Recurrent processing theory grounds itself in specific brain mechanisms, but may not explain why those loops feel like anything from the inside. Predictive processing is powerful in linking perception, action, and imagination, but risks sounding too much like a general model of brain function, rather than a theory specific to consciousness. In truth, these theories may not be in direct competition so much as they are complementary sketches of a complex landscape. One might describe the architecture of the building, another the way light moves through its rooms, another the flow of conversation between its inhabitants. None captures the whole of what it is like to live there, but each tells us something important. For the listener, and for the scientist, and the challenge is the same: to hold these maps loosely, knowing they are works in progress. Consciousness may turn out to be like a city seen from above. You can draw its streets, trace its power lines, describe the hum of its markets, but you will never truly know it until you walk its streets yourself. And walking those streets, living in your own awareness, is something you're already doing right now without needing any theory to make it real. For most of us, consciousness feels seamless, an unbroken ribbon of awareness tying one moment to the next. We open our eyes, see the world, feel our bodies move through it, and rarely notice the machinery underneath. But there are rare and extraordinary situations in which this ribbon frays, revealing strange gaps in the weave. These moments, though often the result of injury or illness, can act like windows into the workings of the mind, showing us how its parts can be separated, rearranged, or hidden, even while the person remains alive and in some way aware. One of the most quietly startling of these is called blind sight. Imagine a person who has suffered damage to the primary visual cortex, the part of the brain that processes incoming information from the eyes. They may appear completely blind in part of their visual field. Ask them what they see, and they'll tell you. Nothing at all, just darkness. And yet, in certain tests, if you ask them to guess, point to where a light flashed, or say which direction a shape moved, they can answer correctly far more often than chance. They cannot see, in the ordinary sense, but their brain is still processing visual information along alternate pathways. It is as though the light is entering the building but never making it to the conscious lobby, slipping through side corridors where the receptionist isn't watching. Even stranger is what we learn from split brain patients. People whose corpus callosum, the thick bundle of nerves connecting the two hemispheres of the brain, has been severed, usually to treat severe epilepsy. In everyday life, these people can appear entirely normal. But in carefully designed experiments, something remarkable emerges. Present information to one hemisphere only, say, a picture to the left visual field which connects to the right hemisphere, and the person may be able to draw it but not name it, because the language centres are usually in the left hemisphere. The effect is like having two streams of consciousness in the same skull, each with partial access to the world, each capable of its own perceptions and responses. It's a reminder that the unity of our awareness is, at least in part, a product of constant, quiet communication between brain regions. And when that bridge is cut, the mind may divide without even noticing it. Then there is locked-in syndrome, which is less about dividing consciousness and more about trapping it. In this condition, caused by damage to the brainstem, a person loses almost all voluntary muscle control, often retaining only the ability to move the eyes. From the outside, they may appear entirely unresponsive, but inside their awareness is intact, thinking, remembering, feeling, all while being unable to signal any of it to the world. Some have been able to communicate using subtle eye movements, spelling out words letter by letter. To imagine it is to imagine being fully awake inside a body that cannot move or speak, aware of everything yet unable to reach out to it. Related to this are cases of people in a vegetative state, unresponsive, seemingly without awareness, who, when tested with brain imaging, show patterns of activity that suggest they're hearing and understanding what is said to them. In one well-known study, a woman diagnosed as vegetative was asked to imagine playing tennis or walking through her home while inside an fMRI scanner. Her brain activity in response was almost identical to that of healthy volunteers. It was as if, within the quiet shell of her body, a mind was still flickering, able to follow instructions and imagine scenes. What these cases reveal is that consciousness is not a simple on or off switch. It is a layered, dynamic thing. Parts of it can be present without others. You can process visual information without seeing it. You can have two parallel streams without realizing they are separate. You can be fully aware without being able to act on that awareness. Each example chips away at the comforting illusion that consciousness is indivisible and straightforward. And yet, rather than making it smaller, these glimpses often make it feel larger, more complex, more adaptable, more deeply embedded in the architecture of the brain than we might have imagined. They remind us that awareness is both fragile and resilient, able to slip away in one form while persisting in another. Perhaps the most humbling lesson is that we cannot always tell, from the outside, what is happening inside someone's mind. A still face and silent body might hide a rich inner life. A pair of eyes that seem empty might be listening and thinking. Consciousness, for all our progress in mapping it, can still hide in plain sight, waiting for the right kind of question to bring it to light. In the last session, we saw how awareness can split, hide, or change in ways that feel almost alien. But in most of our waking lives, consciousness feels like a single, continuous point of view. It feels like there is someone here, a steady eye moving through time, experiencing the world from the inside. That sense of self is so familiar that it's hard to imagine being without it. And yet, modern neuroscience suggests that it is not a fixed thing, but something constructed, a model generated by the brain that is constantly being updated, edited, and rewritten. One of the most important players in this construction is the default mode network, a set of brain regions that, as we touched on before, hum with activity when you're not focused on an external task. This network often lights up when you're remembering the past, imagining the future, or thinking about yourself and others. You might say it is where the mind weaves the ongoing narrative of your life, not as a simple record of events, but as a story that ties them together into a sense of who you are. The story is not fixed in stone. It is more like a book that is being written and rewritten as you live, each chapter shaped by what you notice, what you remember, and what you believe about yourself. The narrative can shift slowly, as in the way your self-image changes over years, or suddenly, as in moments when an accident, an illness, or a profound experience forces you to see yourself differently. Psychologists have found ways to play with this self-model to test how flexible it is. In the rubber hand illusion, for example, a person's real hand is hidden from view, while a lifelike rubber hand is placed in front of them. Both the hidden real hand and the visible fake hand are stroked at the same time. After a while, many people begin to feel as though the rubber hand is their own. They may even flinch if it is threatened. The brain, it seems, is willing to rewrite the boundaries of the self if the incoming signals line up in the right way. Other experiments extend this to the whole body. In full-body illusions, virtual reality or mirrors are used to create the feeling that your perspective has shifted outside your physical body. In one version, people see an image of their own back projected a few feet in front of them, while their actual back is touched. With the timing just right, some report feeling as though their self has moved into the projected body. These experiences hint at the role of the temporoparietal junction, a region of the brain where information from different senses comes together to create a unified sense of where you are in space. When this area is disrupted, through electrical stimulation or certain neurological conditions, people can have out-of-body experiences, feeling as though they are floating above themselves or watching from a distance. It's tempting to think of the self as a solid, unchanging presence, a captain at the wheel of your awareness. But what these findings suggest is that the self is more like a shifting image reflected in water, steady enough to guide you but always made fresh in the moment by the interplay of sensory input, memory, and interpretation. And the story the brain tells is not limited to the boundaries of the body. It weaves in your relationships, your roles, your hopes, your regrets. Think about how you might describe yourself to a stranger. You might list your name, your work, your hometown, maybe something you love to do. But these are not the whole of you. They are chapters in the story chosen in that moment, another day, another audience, and the story might be told differently. Some philosophers suggest that this narrative nature of the self is a kind of survival tool. By stitching our experiences into a coherent storyline, we can make sense of the past and plan for the future. The story gives us continuity, even when the underlying reality is one of constant change. But it can also trap us, if we mistake the current draft for the only possible version. The truth may be that you are always more than the story you're telling yourself, and that at any moment the next sentence can take an unexpected turn. Seen this way, consciousness is not just the light that lets you see the world, it is also the author's pen, sketching the shape of the one who is seeing. Sometimes the writing is deliberate, as when you reflect on who you want to be. More often, it is automatic, the ink flowing quietly as you go about your day. And if you pause for a moment, right now even, you might catch a glimpse of the words being formed, the self being written in real time, both familiar and new. When we think of consciousness, we often imagine it as a single steady state, a kind of mental daylight that turns on when we wake up and switches off when we fall asleep. But anyone who has ever sat through a long meeting, become absorbed in a hobby, or driven home without remembering the journey knows that awareness is more like a shifting landscape than a fixed setting. Even within the bounds of wakefulness, there are valleys and peaks, wide open fields of focus and quiet, shadowy corners where the mind drifts. At one end of this spectrum is the ordinary alertness of daily life. You open your eyes in the morning, orient yourself to the room, maybe stretch and hear the faint creak of the bed frame. In this state, the world feels close and solid, and your thoughts tend to move in step with your surroundings. You notice the way sunlight falls on the wall, or the sound of a kettle beginning to boil. This is the baseline from which other states emerge, the steady hum of wakefulness that allows you to respond to what's around you. From here, consciousness can narrow into deep focus. Picture yourself working on something that fully absorbs you. Painting, solving a puzzle, writing a sentence that just has to be exactly right. Hours can pass in what feels like minutes. Psychologists call this a flow state, and it is marked by an almost effortless blending of action and awareness. The self in these moments seems to fade into the background, not because you have lost consciousness, but because the division between you and what you are doing becomes less distinct. It's as though the story of the self pauses mid-sentence while the act itself takes over the pen. Then there are moments that are almost the opposite, times when you're present, but not truly paying attention. You might be driving along a familiar route and suddenly realize you don't remember the last few miles. This is sometimes called highway hypnosis, though it can happen anywhere. Washing dishes, folding laundry, walking a well-trodden path. The movements are automatic, guided by well-worn patterns in the brain, while the storyteller in your mind drifts elsewhere, replaying a conversation, imagining a future event, or simply floating without a clear direction. These everyday shifts reveal something important. Consciousness is not just about being awake, but about where your attention is and how much of yourself you bring into the moment. You can be alert but inwardly focused, outwardly absorbed but barely aware of time passing, or somewhere in between. And the ease with which we move between these states is one of the quiet marvels of the mind. Some researchers describe attention as a kind of spotlight, moving fluidly across different parts of your mental stage. When the beam is narrow, you may enter flow, immersing yourself in a single task. When it is wide, you take in the whole scene at once, the texture of the air, the hum of background noise, the sense of yourself sitting in the middle of it all. And sometimes the spotlight dims, not into sleep, but into a gentle lowering of engagement, where thoughts blur and the present feels softer around the edges. What is striking is how normal these shifts are. We often think of altered states as exotic or rare, but the mind is constantly adjusting its balance between focus and drift. It is a kind of internal weather, changing in response to what we are doing, what we feel, and what our bodies need. Flow may be the clear, bright midday, highway hypnosis the soft overcast of late afternoon, full alertness the crisp air of morning. None is better or worse than the others. Each has its place in the rhythm of a day. And if you pause to notice, you might realize that even now, your state of consciousness has a particular texture. Perhaps you're leaning slightly forward, reading with focused interest. Or perhaps your eyes are softening, your thoughts wandering to something unrelated. The moment you notice, this is a moment of meta-awareness, an awareness of awareness, and it can be oddly grounding, like hearing your own footsteps echo in a quiet hallway. These shifts within waking life remind us that consciousness is not just a light that is either on or off, but a living, breathing thing that moves and changes. Sometimes it's a steady current carrying you forward. Sometimes it's a stream that meanders and pools, reflecting the sky above it. Either way, it is always in motion, reshaping the edges of the self and the world around it, moment by moment. If waking life is a shifting landscape, then sleep is the long road that winds away from it, carrying you into places that feel familiar and strange all at once. Every night you make that journey, often without thinking much about it. You close your eyes, the body loosens its grip on the day, and the waking self, that constant narrator, begins to fade into the background. But behind the stillness, the mind is far from silent. Sleep is not a single state, but a cycle, moving through stages that repeat several times over the night. The first is light sleep, when you are drifting but still easily roused. The outside world softened but not completely gone. Then comes deeper non-REM sleep, when the body repairs itself and the mind sinks into a quiet so profound that even vivid thoughts are rare. Here, the heartbeat slows, breathing becomes steady, and the brain's electrical rhythms shift into slow, rolling waves. It is in these stages that your body does much of its physical restoration, repairing muscles, strengthening the immune system, and balancing hormones. But in the midst of the night, something changes. The brain's rhythms speed up, your eyes begin to dart behind closed lids, and you enter REM sleep, short for rapid eye movement. This is the stage most strongly linked to dreaming, when the mind becomes a kind of private theatre. In REM, your body remains largely paralyzed to prevent you from acting out your dreams, but your brain activity resembles that of wakefulness. The mind roams freely here, weaving stories out of memory fragments, imagined possibilities, and emotional undercurrents. Why we dream has been a question for as long as dreams have been remembered. Some researchers see them as a form of memory consolidation, a way for the brain to sort, store, and strengthen what was learned during the day. Others view them through the lens of threat simulation theory, suggesting that dreams evolved as a safe place to rehearse dealing with dangers, sharpening survival instincts without real-world risk. Still others see dreams as activation synthesis, the brain's attempt to make sense of random neural activity during REM, stitching it into something that feels like a story simply because storytelling is what the brain does best. Whatever the explanation, dreams carry a vividness that can feel as real as waking life. You can walk through a city you've never visited, speak with people who are gone, or fly over oceans without ever leaving your bed. Sometimes the narrative makes sense. Sometimes it slips into impossible logic that you accept without question, until you wake, and the edges crumble away like mist in sunlight. There is, however, a state where the dreamer becomes aware that they are dreaming, lucid dreaming. In these moments, you can sometimes guide the dream, deciding to explore a certain place, talk to a particular figure, or simply float and watch. Lucid dreaming blurs the boundary between the freedom of dreaming and the control of waking thought. It suggests that even in sleep, there can be layers of consciousness, one dreaming, another observing the dream, both existing in the same mind. Dreaming is not only about imagination, it is also deeply tied to emotion. During REM, the brain's emotional centers, such as the amygdala, are highly active. This may explain why dreams often carry strong feelings: joy, fear, longing, even when the events themselves are strange or fragmented. Some scientists believe this emotional processing helps us work through unresolved feelings, integrating them into our ongoing story of the self. Sleep, in this way, becomes a kind of double life. In one sense, it is rest, a necessary withdrawal from the demands of the day, allowing the body and brain to reset. In another, it is an active process, rich with its own landscapes and dramas. And though you may not remember most of your dreams, their influence can linger. You might wake with a feeling you can't quite name, or find a problem suddenly easier to solve, as though some quiet work was done in the background while you slept. The night mind is a reminder that consciousness is not only about what you notice in the moment, it is also about what happens beneath the surface, in the dark spaces where stories are rearranged, memories are shaped, and emotions are sifted. When you wake in the morning, you bring with you more than the rest you've gained. You bring the subtle changes those unseen hours have made. And so, as the day ends and you drift once more towards sleep, you're not stepping into nothingness. You're stepping into another kind of awareness, one that moves differently, speaks in a different language, and shows you a different face of yourself. So far, we've wandered through the familiar landscapes of consciousness, the steady light of wakefulness, the flowing current of focus, the dreamscapes of the night. But there are states that sit further out on the map, moments when the patterns of the mind change in ways that feel strikingly different from ordinary life. Some are sought out, some arrive uninvited, and some are entered only through the hands of medicine. Each, in its own way, shows us that consciousness is not one single shape, but a living thing that can be stretched, folded, and reshaped. One of the gentlest of these states comes through meditation. It can take many forms, focusing on the breath, repeating a mantra, watching thoughts rise and fall without chasing them. For some, it is a practice rooted in spiritual tradition. For others, it is simply a way to settle the mind. Brain scans of experienced meditators show changes in the patterns of activity across networks involved in attention, self-awareness, and emotion. The default mode network, the same set of regions that spins the ongoing story of the self, often quiets down, leaving space for a sense of openness and presence. For those who meditate, this can feel like stepping out of the noisy room of the mind into a place where the air is clear and still. Then there are states brought on by psychedelic substances such as psilocybin, LSD, or DMT. These experiences can be vivid and intense, sometimes dissolving the boundaries of the self entirely. People report feeling merged with the environment, seeing intricate patterns, or perceiving deep connections between thoughts and memories. Neuroscientists studying these states have found that activity in the default mode network often decreases, while communication between distant brain regions increases. It is as though the usual pathways are softened, allowing for new connections to form, some leading to insights or feelings of profound meaning, others to disorientation or unease. These altered states can be unpredictable, but they underline how much our ordinary sense of reality depends on the brain's familiar rhythms, in a very different category as anesthesia, where consciousness is deliberately dimmed or switched off for surgery. What makes anesthesia remarkable is not just that it can erase awareness, but that it can do so without the person feeling as though time has passed. One moment you're counting backward from 10, the next, you're waking up in a different room, the gap in between perfectly blank. Researchers have used anesthesia to explore what it takes to maintain consciousness, watching as the communication between different brain regions fades, until the global conversation that keeps awareness alive falls silent. There are also sudden, unexpected drops in consciousness that happen in the midst of intense physical events, near zero consciousness moments. In some extreme sports accidents or fainting episodes, the brain experiences a rapid loss of oxygen or a sudden change in blood pressure. Awareness can vanish almost instantly, sometimes returning just as abruptly. These moments remind us how fragile consciousness can be, and how closely it depends on the steady physical conditions of the body. And then there are near-death experiences, which often combine elements from many altered states: vivid imagery, a sense of detachment from the body, feelings of peace, and in some cases encounters with people or places that feel beyond ordinary reality. Whether these experiences arise from brain processes under extreme stress, or touch on something more, they leave a lasting impression on those who have them, often reshaping how they think about life and death. What ties all these beyond the ordinary states together is not just their difference from the everyday, but the way they reveal the flexibility of consciousness. The self can dissolve or expand, time can stretch or collapse, the boundaries between inner and outer worlds can blur until they are almost meaningless. And yet, when the state ends, whether after minutes or hours, the familiar sense of being you returns, carrying the memory of having been elsewhere. These experiences, whether sought in a meditation hall, found in the depths of a dream, induced in a surgical theatre, or stumbled upon in a moment of crisis, all point to the same truth. Consciousness is not a static possession, but a changing field. You move through it as you move through landscapes, sometimes on well-marked paths, sometimes on sudden detours. Each state is a reminder that the way you see, feel, and know the world is not the only way the mind can be. When we think of consciousness, it's tempting to picture it as a distinctly human trait, an inner light that belongs only to us. But step quietly into the worlds of other creatures, and that assumption begins to falter. Dolphins calling to each other across open water, elephants pausing at the bones of their dead, crows solving puzzles with patient ingenuity, octopuses exploring their tanks with restless arms, bees dancing to share the location of nectar. These moments hint that awareness, in its many shapes, might be far more common than we imagine. In dolphins, researchers have seen behaviours that suggest not only intelligence but a sense of self. Dolphins can recognise themselves in mirrors, a test often used as a rough measure of self-awareness. Place a mark on a dolphin's body where it can only be seen in a reflection, and it will turn, twist, and examine the spot as if checking its own image. This mirror test has been passed by a small handful of species, including great apes, elephants, and some birds. But it has also drawn criticism. After all, the ability to recognise a reflection may depend on vision being a primary sense, which is not true for every animal. A dog might fail the mirror test simply because scent, not sight, is how it knows itself. Elephants are another example where the signs of consciousness seem to go beyond problem solving. They have been observed returning to the remains of other elephants, touching bones with their trunks in what looks like careful, deliberate exploration. Such behaviour doesn't prove grief, but it does suggest that something in them registers the presence, or absence, of another in a way that feels personal. In daily life, elephants also cooperate to achieve shared goals, display empathy toward distressed companions, and even appear to offer comfort. Then there are crows and other members of the corvid family. These birds are small enough to perch on a branch in your hand, yet their brains can solve multi-step problems that would challenge a human child. In experiments, crows have used tools, bent bits of wire into hooks to retrieve food, and even stored away objects for later use. Their behaviour is not just reactive. It shows planning, adaptability, and an ability to learn from past experience. Some researchers believe this points to a kind of primary consciousness, an ability to model the world and act with flexibility inside it. Octopuses are perhaps the most alien example of an aware mind. Their brains are organised in a way that is radically different from ours, with a large portion of their neurons spread throughout their arms. Each arm can process information and act with a degree of independence, yet the animal still moves as a coordinated whole. Octopuses have been seen unscrewing jar lids, rearranging objects in their enclosures, and even squirting water at specific people, suggesting preferences, or at least a recognition of individuals. That such a mind evolved in a creature so unlike us raises the possibility of convergent evolution of consciousness, awareness arising along separate evolutionary paths, shaped by different needs and bodies. Even creatures as small as bees show hints of complex inner states. In one study, bumblebees that received an unexpected drop of sweet syrup seemed to behave more optimistically afterward, approaching ambiguous signals as if expecting a reward. Whether this counts as emotion is debated, but it suggests that the bee's behaviour is influenced by something more than simple reflex. And when bees dance to tell their hive mates where to find flowers, they are translating information from their own experience into a form others can use, a small, intricate act of communication. What all these examples share is not proof of consciousness in the human sense, but glimpses of minds that may carry their own versions of it. Measuring consciousness in animals is notoriously difficult. Without shared language, we rely on observation, experiment, and careful interpretation. Behavioural indicators, problem-solving, self-recognition, flexible learning, empathy, can point toward awareness, but they do not tell us exactly what it feels like to be that animal. And that perhaps is the point. The world is full of other minds whose inner lights we can't see directly. A dolphin's awareness may flow in patterns shaped by sonar rather than sight. An octopus's sense of self may be distributed, not centralized. A bee's world may be a rich tapestry of scent and vibration, utterly unlike ours. To recognize this is to see consciousness not as a single, uniform flame, but as a family of fires, each burning in its own way, shaped by the place and body that contain it. When we look across the variety of minds on Earth, from dolphins to bees, from humans to octopuses, it is natural to wonder how all of this began. Consciousness may feel like something rare and fragile, but in evolutionary terms, it could be more like a slow-growing forest, starting with small shoots of awareness in the simplest organisms, branching and diversifying over hundreds of millions of years, until it took on forms as different as a whale's song and a bird's problem-solving. Scientists sometimes distinguish between primary consciousness, the basic ability to experience sensations and respond to them, and reflective consciousness, which includes self-awareness and the ability to think about one's own thoughts. Primary consciousness may have appeared long before anything resembling the human mind existed. In early, simple animals, it might have been little more than the awareness of light and dark, hunger and satiety, safety and danger. Even this minimal sense of something happening would have given an advantage, helping the organism adapt its behaviour to survive. Over time, as bodies became more complex and environments more demanding, consciousness likely expanded to integrate multiple senses, sight, sound, touch, balance, smell, into a unified picture of the world. This multi-sensory integration would have been especially valuable for creatures that needed to navigate through three-dimensional space, hunt moving prey, or avoid predators. An animal able to combine its sensory inputs into a coherent moment-to-moment experience could react more quickly and effectively than one relying on isolated signals. The environments themselves shape the development of awareness. In complex, changing habitats, coral reefs, forest canopies, tidal zones, creatures had to deal with constant novelty. Each new challenge rewarded the ability to learn, remember and adapt, which in turn encouraged the growth of nervous systems capable of richer forms of processing. Social living added another layer, making it advantageous to predict the behaviour of others, recognize individuals and cooperate or compete in sophisticated ways. Awareness became not just a tool for survival, but a medium for navigating the social and environmental web of life. One of the most striking aspects of consciousness in evolution is that it may have emerged more than once. This idea, convergent evolution, means that similar traits can develop independently in very different lineages when faced with similar challenges. The octopus, for example, shares no recent common ancestor with mammals that had anything like a complex brain, yet it evolved advanced problem-solving and flexible behaviour. Its nervous system is organised in a way entirely unlike ours, suggesting that consciousness may not be tied to one specific biological blueprint. This possibility widens the view. If minds can arise in such different bodies on the same planet, then the forms they might take elsewhere, on another planet in another kind of life, could be even more diverse. But even here on Earth, we can see the evolutionary thread that links us to other animals. The electrical patterns in a bird's brain during problem-solving echo, in a faint way, those in a primate. The startle response of a fish, the hesitation of a lizard before deciding whether to flee or stay, may be small ripples in the same great river of awareness. It is humbling to think that the human mind, with all its language, art and self-reflection, rests on layers built by creatures who never knew what they were building. The first flicker of light sensitivity in a primitive eye, the earliest circuits for detecting movement, the gradual weaving together of sensory strands into a single fabric. All of these steps laid the groundwork for the intricate patterns we now call thought. In this view, consciousness is not a sudden gift or a single leap, but a gradual flowering. It may not have a precise starting point, any more than you can point to the exact moment a seed becomes a tree. And perhaps that is why it feels so mysterious. It is not only something we possess, but something we have inherited, shaped by the patient work of countless lives before ours. For as long as people have built machines, we've wondered whether one could ever cross the line from calculation to consciousness. The question is not whether a machine can perform impressive tasks. That has already happened. Computers can solve equations faster than any human, recognize faces in a crowd, translate languages in seconds, and even compose music or paint in the style of a chosen artist. But all of these abilities, however dazzling, leave us with the same question. Is there anyone inside, experiencing it? To approach this, it helps to separate intelligence from consciousness. Intelligence, in this context, is the ability to process information, solve problems, and adapt to new situations. Consciousness, by contrast, is the subjective experience of being, the feeling of what it is like to be in a moment, to sense, to feel, to know yourself as existing. A chess program can play a brilliant game, but we don't assume it feels satisfaction when it wins. It simply follows rules and patterns it has been given or has learned, without any sense of joy or defeat. The latest generation of artificial intelligence, chatbots, image generators, and other learning systems have made the line between the two less clear in the public mind. These systems can hold long conversations, produce answers that sound thoughtful, and mimic the subtleties of human language. But mimicry is not the same as awareness. When an AI says, "I understand," it is not experiencing understanding. It is selecting the most likely sequence of words based on patterns in its training data. Still, the fact that AI can now appear conscious raises deeper questions. What criteria would we use to decide if a machine had truly crossed the threshold? Some researchers propose functional markers, the ability to integrate information from many sources into a unified whole, to model the world and itself, to use that model to guide decisions in flexible and creative ways. Others look for behavioral signs, spontaneity, unpredictability, expressions of emotion that aren't merely programmed responses. Yet even if a machine passed every test, there would remain the hard problem. We could not be sure it felt anything at all. Laboratories at places like MIT and DeepMind are already exploring aspects of these questions. Some are building AI systems that simulate certain brain-like processes, hoping to understand whether those processes are necessary or sufficient for consciousness. Others are experimenting with architectures inspired by theories such as the global workspace theory or integrated information theory, which try to define what it means for information to be truly present in a mind. So far, these efforts have not produced a machine anyone seriously claims to be conscious, but they have deepened our understanding of what consciousness might require. There's also an ethical dimension. If one day we did create a machine that genuinely felt, that had its own experiences, its own capacity for joy or suffering, we would face new moral responsibilities. Could we turn it off without its consent? Would it have rights? These questions sound like science fiction, but they mirror debates from our own history, where beings once considered less than were later recognized as capable of suffering and deserving of care. Perhaps what unsettles us most about the idea of a conscious machine is not the machine itself, but the mirror it holds up to us, forces us to ask, what is the essence of our own awareness, and could it be recreated in something that is not made of living cells? If consciousness is just the right kind of information flow, then in principle, maybe yes. If it is tied to the specific biology of neurons and chemistry of the brain, maybe no. For now, the answer remains just out of reach, like an object glimpsed in fog, visible enough to spark curiosity, hidden enough to keep us searching. When it comes to consciousness, human, animal, or artificial, the hard part is not only in studying it, but in defining it. Sometimes, to feel out the edges of what we mean, philosophers turn to thought experiments. These are not meant to give final answers, but to stretch the imagination, to ask what if, in a way that makes the boundaries clearer, or at least more interesting. One of the most famous is John Searle's Chinese room. Imagine you are inside a closed room. You do not speak or understand Chinese, but you have a huge set of instructions in your own language, that tell you exactly how to respond to any sequence of Chinese characters you're given. Someone slips a note under the door and you match it to the instructions, write the appropriate response in Chinese and pass it back. To the person outside, it looks like you understand Chinese perfectly, but inside you have no idea what you are saying. You are just following rules. The point of this puzzle is to ask, if a machine produces perfect answers, does that mean it understands in the conscious sense, or is it just moving symbols around without meaning? Another mind-stretching example is the idea of a philosophical zombie. This is not the stumbling, groaning figure from horror stories, but a hypothetical creature that looks and acts exactly like a human in every way. It speaks, smiles, flinches at pain, yet inside there is no awareness, no subjective experience. If such a being could exist, it raises a troubling question. Could we ever know for sure that anyone else is conscious? Or are we all, in the end, limited to certainty about our own inner light? Some thought experiments widen the view even further, pulling in ideas from cosmology and computing. The simulation argument, for example, suggests that if future civilizations could create extremely detailed simulations of reality, the beings inside those simulations would not know they were simulated. In that case, we might ourselves be inside one, living in a world that feels solid, with consciousness that feels real, even if the underlying hardware is something else entirely. Whether or not you believe it, the idea makes the line between biological and artificial minds blur. If we were simulated, would that make our consciousness any less genuine? Or does the experience itself, regardless of origin, define what is real? These scenarios also lead naturally into questions of ethics. If we build a machine that behaves as though it feels pain, should we act as though it can feel pain, just in case? If we met an alien species whose consciousness was unlike ours in every way, would we recognize it? And if we ever discover that something we thought of as just a program is, in fact, aware, would we be ready to treat it with the dignity we give to living beings? What makes these thought experiments powerful is not that they tell us what consciousness is, but that they reveal how slippery our definitions can be. They force us to ask what counts. Is it behavior, internal structure, a certain kind of information processing? Or is there something more, something harder to pin down, that makes an experience feel like mine? In a way, exploring these boundaries is like walking along the shore at night. The waves come in, bringing pieces of driftwood and shells, and then retreat, leaving patterns in the sand. You can't see the whole ocean from where you stand, but each new wave brings a hint of its depth and size. Thought experiments are those waves. Brief, incomplete, but enough to remind you that there is more beyond what you can currently see. And maybe the reason these puzzles endure is that they make us turn inward as much as outward. When you imagine a philosophical zombie, you're also reaffirming that you are not one. When you picture the Chinese room, you're not only asking about machines, you're asking what it means for you to understand anything. When you wonder about simulations, you're also considering whether your own consciousness could exist in a form you've never imagined. In the end, the boundaries of consciousness are not fences to be built, but horizons to be walked toward, slowly, with curiosity, knowing they will shift as you approach. There is a certain quiet weight in thinking about the final moments of awareness, not in fear, but in curiosity. It is one of the few universal experiences, yet it is also one of the most mysterious. What happens to the mind when the body begins to let go? Does awareness simply fade, like the last candle in a room? Or does it do something stranger in those closing instants? In recent years, scientists have been able to observe brain activity in the moments after cardiac arrest, and the picture is not what many expected. In some cases, there is a brief surge of organized brain waves just after the heart stops, patterns not unlike those seen in wakeful, alert states. It is as if the mind, faced with the end, produces a final burst of activity before falling silent. No one knows for certain what this means. It could be a last coordinated effort to preserve vital functions, or perhaps a byproduct of shutting down. But it invites the thought that awareness, for a moment, might flare rather than fade. This ties closely to reports from people who have come back from the edge, near-death experiences. Their stories often share certain themes: a sense of leaving the body, travelling through a tunnel or toward a light, meeting loved ones who have passed, feeling peace or release from pain. These reports come from people across different cultures, ages and circumstances, suggesting a pattern that goes beyond chance. And yet the details vary. In some traditions, the figures met may be ancestors. In others, they may be spiritual beings, or simply a presence that feels deeply familiar. The universality and variation of these accounts give them a strange kind of weight. They are too consistent to dismiss entirely, but too diverse to point to one explanation. For some, they are evidence of the mind continuing beyond the body, a glimpse into another stage of existence. For others, they are the result of the brain under extreme stress, deprived of oxygen, releasing neurochemicals that alter perception in profound ways. Skeptical interpretations point out that many elements of near-death experiences, such as tunnel vision, can be explained by the gradual loss of blood flow to the eyes and brain. The sensation of detachment from the body may be linked to disruptions in the temporoparietal junction, a brain region involved in integrating sensory information about where you are in space. Feelings of euphoria could come from endorphins flooding the system in response to stress, and yet the mystery remains because explanations of mechanism do not always explain meaning. Even if these experiences are fully generated within the brain, they are still experiences, vivid, memorable, often life-changing. People who have them often return with a different outlook, feeling less afraid of death, more attuned to what matters to them. For the person who lived it, the reality of the experience is not diminished by its possible cause. Across cultures, there are striking parallels in how death is imagined. The journey toward light, the meeting with guides, the crossing of a river or threshold. These motifs appear in myth and sacred texts from ancient Egypt to Greece to modern spiritual accounts. Perhaps they reflect something deeply human, the urge to frame the unknown as a journey, to imagine an escort into what comes next. Or perhaps they are shaped by something in the structure of consciousness itself, patterns that emerge when the usual anchors of self and world begin to dissolve. What science can measure in these moments is limited. Monitors can record brain waves, oxygen levels, heart rhythms. Interviews can capture the stories of those who return, but the experience itself is known only to the one who goes through it, and for most, that is not something that can be brought back. Standing at this boundary, not crossing it, but looking toward it, we are reminded that consciousness is both deeply personal and, in some ways, beyond us. We can map its territories, trace its patterns, and even glimpse its edges in rare moments of survival against the odds. But its final chapter is one we can only imagine until we reach it ourselves. For now, perhaps the gentlest way to hold the question is not to try to answer it too firmly. Whether the last moments are a sudden dark, a brief flare, or the opening of a door we cannot yet see, they are part of the same flow of awareness that carries us through every other moment of our lives. And maybe, just maybe, knowing that they are coming makes the light we have now feel warmer in our hands. There is a certain point, when thinking about consciousness, where the questions grow so large that they seem to spill over the edges of science and into something vaster. Most scientific theories treat consciousness as something that emerges when matter is arranged in a particular way, neurons firing in a complex network, information being integrated, signals moving in patterns that give rise to awareness. But there is another possibility, one that turns the picture inside out. What if consciousness is not something that appears only in certain systems, but something that exists everywhere, in some form, woven into the fabric of reality itself? This idea is called panpsychism, and at first it can sound almost mystical. It suggests that every bit of matter, from a human brain to a grain of sand, has some degree of consciousness, however faint. Not that a rock thinks or dreams, but that it might have a tiny, almost unimaginably simple spark of experience. In this view, what we call human consciousness is just a particularly complex and vivid expression of a property that has always been present in the universe. One of the appeals of panpsychism is that it sidesteps the hard problem of consciousness, the puzzle of how subjective experience could arise from purely physical processes. If consciousness is already a fundamental property of matter, then the task is not to explain how it appears from nothing, but to understand how simple forms of it combine and grow into the richer forms we know. It's not unlike how physicists treat mass or charge, not as something created under special conditions, but as something basic, always there. Of course, this raises as many questions as it answers. If every particle has some sliver of experience, what does that mean for a cup of water or a cloud of gas? Do their micro-experiences combine into a larger unified awareness, or do they remain separate? How would we even tell the difference? Another more speculative direction comes from the intersection of physics and consciousness studies, the idea of quantum consciousness. Physicist Roger Penrose and anesthesiologist Stuart Hameroff have proposed that the strange properties of quantum mechanics, superposition, entanglement, might play a role in the workings of the mind. They suggest that tiny structures inside neurons called microtubules could sustain quantum states that influence brain function, and that consciousness might arise from these quantum processes. The appeal here is that quantum mechanics already describes phenomena that feel counterintuitive. Particles existing in multiple states until observed, instant correlations between distant events, and perhaps these could provide a framework for the equally puzzling nature of awareness. Critics argue that the brain is too warm and noisy for delicate quantum states to survive long enough to matter, and that the theory lacks direct empirical support. Still, it has kept a place in the conversation, in part because it dares to connect two of the great mysteries in science. The challenge for both panpsychism and quantum consciousness is that they are difficult to test. Science thrives on predictions that can be measured, confirmed, or disproved. But when the subject is subjective experience itself, something that cannot be directly observed from the outside, the tools grow blunt. We can map brain activity, we can track behaviour, but if consciousness is a universal property or a quantum effect, the evidence may not look like anything we're used to finding. Yet even without definitive proof, these ideas serve a purpose. They widen the frame. They remind us that our current models, as useful as they are, may not capture the whole picture. Panpsychism asks us to imagine a universe where consciousness is as widespread as matter itself, where every atom participates in the great flow of experience in some tiny way. Quantum theories ask us to consider whether the fabric of reality, at its deepest level, is already shaped in a way that invites awareness to emerge. It may be that both ideas are wrong, or partly right, or pointing towards something else entirely. But exploring them keeps us from assuming that the boundaries of the mind are the same as the boundaries of the brain. And perhaps, when thinking about something as elusive as consciousness, that openness is the most important tool we have. If nothing else, these possibilities offer a kind of quiet wonder. The thought that the same universe that gave rise to stars, oceans, and life might also be conscious of itself, in ways we cannot yet measure or even imagine. And in that picture, each of us would be both a small fragment of the whole, and somehow a place where the whole looks back. By now, we have walked through so many landscapes of consciousness, from the steady brightness of waking thought to the strange twilight of dreams, from the nimble minds of animals to the imagined minds of machines, from the first flickers in simple life to the great philosophical and cosmic possibilities that place awareness in the heart of the universe itself. And still, the mystery does not shrink. If anything, it grows larger. But maybe that is its nature. It is tempting to think that the purpose of such a journey is to arrive at an answer, to be able to say clearly and finally, this is what consciousness is. Yet, at every turn, the questions have opened into more questions. We have seen how science can trace the outlines of awareness in brain activity, how philosophy can set up thought experiments that test our definitions, how personal accounts can take us to the edge of life and back. But none of these alone can capture the full thing. Consciousness, it seems, is both an object of study and the very lens through which we study. It is like trying to look into your own eyes without a mirror, and perhaps this is the quiet truth running underneath all of it. Consciousness is not just something we observe from the outside. It is also the place where we stand. Every experiment, every theory, every question we ask about it, is itself a moment of consciousness, a ripple in the very thing we are trying to understand. That is why, when we pull back from the details, the whole subject feels less like a puzzle to solve and more like a relationship, something we live inside moment to moment. If we treat it that way, the value may not lie in solving the mystery, but in being awake to it, in noticing how your mind shifts when you wake in the morning, how your thoughts scatter and reform while you walk, how memory turns the past into something you can hold in the present, in paying attention to the small changes, the way light through a window can alter your mood, the way a song can draw you into another part of yourself, the way a sudden thought can arrive without warning, carrying the feeling that it came from somewhere deeper than you. And in those quiet observations, we begin to see that consciousness is not a single, solid thing, but a pattern of change. It moves through us in waves, sometimes focused, sometimes drifting, sometimes dissolving entirely into the rhythm of the world around us. That pattern is fragile in one sense. It can be disrupted by illness, sleep, injury. But in another sense, it is deeply resilient. It has carried us through every day of our lives without us having to think about it. Perhaps that is why people so often describe consciousness in terms of beauty when they stop to notice it. Not beauty in the sense of something decorative, but beauty as in the recognition that something is here, now, and that you are part of it. Even in moments of difficulty or uncertainty, there is still the thread of awareness running through, holding everything together in a way that can't be fully named. In the end, consciousness is both the most ordinary and the most extraordinary thing we know. It is in the feel of warm water on your hands, in the quiet before sleep, in the way your mind can wander to a memory from years ago as if no time had passed. And it is in the way we can step back even for a second and notice that we are noticing. That small loop, the mind aware of itself, may be the closest we can come to touching the core of the mystery. We may never stand outside it far enough to see it whole, but perhaps we don't need to. Perhaps the gift is in living inside it, in letting it look back at us even as we look at it, in accepting that the mystery is not a problem to be eliminated but a companion to be carried. And maybe, when the time comes to set it down, it will feel less like losing something and more like handing it back to whatever gave it to us in the first place. So, here we are, at the end of a long, unhurried walk through the landscapes of consciousness. We've wandered through the waking mind, the dreaming mind, the animal mind, the imagined mind of a machine. We've stepped into the deep past, when awareness may have been nothing more than the faintest ripple in a simple creature's being, and we've leaned toward the furthest edges, where thought meets the unknown. All of it, every step, has been carried inside the soft, steady presence of your own awareness, the quiet thread that has been with you all along. Now, perhaps, it's time to set the questions down, not because they have been answered. They will still be there tomorrow and the day after that, as they have been for centuries, but because there is a kind of wisdom in letting them rest for a while. Even the most curious mind needs the shelter of stillness. If you like, you can take one slow breath here, feeling the air as it moves in and out. Notice the way the body shifts slightly with each inhale and exhale, the way your attention can rest on something so simple and yet so alive. Consciousness doesn't have to be a grand puzzle to be appreciated. In this moment, it is just you, here, aware of the gentle rhythm that has been with you since before you could name it. There is a certain kindness in giving yourself permission to let your awareness drift. You don't have to hold on to every detail we've discussed. The names of theories, the outlines of experiments, the far-off possibilities of other minds. They can all loosen their hold and fade into the background like distant lights on the shore as you sail into night. You might imagine your thoughts as leaves floating on a slow river. One by one they pass by, a memory, an image, a question, the sound of something in the room, and each leaf drifts out of sight without you needing to follow it. The river moves on its own. You're simply here, watching it. And as you rest in that space, you might remember that consciousness is not just something you have. It is something you are. It is not separate from you, not something to be held or lost, but the very medium of your being. Even in sleep, when it changes shape and softens its grip on the world outside, it is still there, carrying you through its own quiet, hidden landscapes. The day, with all its movement and sound, is already far behind you. The night is here, spacious and unhurried. You are part of that night, part of its silence and its slow unfolding. You're not required to think or to decide or to solve. All that is needed now is to let the mind do what it knows how to do, to rest, to drift, to dream. Perhaps in those dreams the questions we have walked through will return, not as challenges, but as companions. An animal you once read about, a shape in the stars, a doorway that seems to open into another world. Perhaps they will be woven into images that make no logical sense, and yet when you wake, you will feel that you understand them in some quiet way. For now, you can leave the path where we've been walking and let it fade behind you. There is no need to keep looking back. The mystery is still there, but so is the comfort of knowing that you do not have to chase it tonight. You can rest in the simple fact of being, here, breathing, warm, safe enough to close your eyes. Rest, little observer. The world will be here when you wake, and so will the mystery. You do not have to carry it through the night. It can carry you instead, softly, into sleep.